With ancient philosophy covered, it is time to move into the next major period, and that is medieval philosophy, which represents a stark shift in thought, much like with other areas of inquiry. Before diving into the particulars, it's important to note that philosophical ideas permeated religious thought during this time, so the major religions of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam exchanged values and ideas with philosophy. The eclectic heritage, especially the Neoplatonists, grew stronger by embracing the Abrahamic religions while infusing traditionally pagan topics and authors. For example, the Platonic idea of a one in a realm beyond the senses, and that of an immortal soul, as these were easily adaptable to the mainstream religions, due to their idea of a single, all-encompassing deity and their belief in an afterlife. Paul of Tarsus, one of the main apostles of Jesus, whose letters had a lasting effect on Christianity's future doctrines, received a classical philosophical education and had a pretty good knowledge of Hellenistic philosophy in general. He used metaphors and concepts from Stoicism to explain Christianity to those new to the religion, and even spoke in Athens about the good news, arguing with Stoics and Epicureans. Some scholars even say that the concept of sin in Christianity has roots in the Stoic concept of passion. In both cases, you need to avoid sin or passion if you want to live a fulfilled life. In the opening of John's Gospel, he says that, "In the beginning was the Word," and we can understand word here as being equivalent to the Greek word logos, which can mean either word or reason. For Judaism, they understood reason and wisdom in the philosophical sense as manifestations of God itself. Later, the Byzantine Empire would have great exchanges in astronomical, mathematical, and philosophical knowledge with Islamic states, which later became the center of scientific knowledge during the medieval ages. During that time, reason and faith, philosophy and religious thought walked hand in hand. Although many ancient philosophical schools remain relevant to this day, around the 6th century CE, they were largely dismissed or outright banned in the West for being pagan or simply non-Christian. Again, Aristotle's writings would even be partially forgotten in the West by the 6th century until their resurgence in the 12th century thanks to the thorough efforts of Byzantine and Arabic philosophers, who considered him the first teacher. Even though Platonic influence was undeniable, very few works of Plato were actually read, and his complete writings would only be thoroughly translated and circulated by the 15th century. The beginning of the medieval period in philosophy is usually associated with St. Augustine in the 4th century CE, and its end around the 15th century with the Renaissance and the birth of modern philosophy. The first period is called the patristic, as in the study of the fathers of the Christian church canon, a very stagnant period with a handful of major authors. This was followed by the scholastic period in the 10th century, characterized by the birth of universities and more widespread study of philosophy. Augustine of Hippo, later canonized as a saint by the Church, is considered not only the first, but also the most influential philosopher of medieval times. As ancient authors were secondary at best to religious teachings, he excelled in dialoguing with what was then known of those teachings, and also providing original Christian thought. A pagan himself converted late in life, he wrote about desire and the role of reason, fleshing out much of what the concept of original sin means in Christianity today. Reminiscent of Stoicism, reason was a central part of his thought against desire, or the appetites of the soul. Reason, aided by divine illumination, would be the only path to wisdom, which was ultimately to be one with the Christian God, or to know God and the soul. However, he criticized the Stoics and ancient philosophers in general, even Plato, of arrogance, for claiming to be able to achieve happiness without faith, or for believing in pagan religions. Clearly, philosophy and theology were the same for him, but true philosophy required Christian faith. Rational desire, guided by divine grace or love, would be a manifestation of this junction in contrast to lust, and would be the foundation for free will, justice, and virtuous actions in general. Boethius would be the next major thinker later in the 6th century, also being an important Neoplatonist and best known for his translation of a handful of Aristotle's works, becoming one of the few direct beacons of ancient philosophy in the newer medieval times, especially for logic. Arrested and sentenced to death for political reasons, he wrote dialogues with a personified Lady Philosophy, in which he also defends the indiscernibility between faith and reason, but relying more on the ancient philosophy he knew and on his original thought than on Christian ideas. Similar to a last will, personal issues arise as he tackles philosophical concepts. Given that he was an influential and rich man who lost his eminence and was waiting for death, he wrote on the fickleness of the material realm, as well as the timelessness and certainty of a Platonic ideal realm akin to the divine. Thus, the lady would defend, true happiness is achievable despite all material losses, which in turn cannot by themselves define a good life, rather being merely ornamental. God would be the final good end to all, whose mere existence maintains the world's stability, but could also intervene by mysterious divine providence, explaining his questioning of why bad things happen to good people. Free will, then, would be achievable only to divine beings and those contemplative of the Christian God. Several centuries would pass, with philosophy taking the back seat during these dark ages, up until the year 1000, though it had a brief resurgence in the Carolingian Renaissance when Charlemagne and his successors established a period focused on culture and education. John Scotus, meaning Scottish, Eriugena, would be the main philosophical figure in this period, translating several Greek texts, as well as writing and teaching in Neoplatonist fashion similar to Augustine, but nevertheless considered a heretic, likely due to Christendom's unfamiliarity with these themes. Further stagnation would occur until Anselm of Canterbury, also later canonized as a saint, who arose in the late 11th century by bringing more philosophical methodology to theological matters, culminating in the ontological argument for the existence of the Christian God. A Neoplatonist like his predecessors, he argued that this God would be the greatest being to exist, composed then of all the best qualities. Therefore, even non-believers or fools would be able to imagine a being such as that. However, if it would only exist in their mind, it would not be this God, as existence would have to be an intrinsic quality of being the utmost being. Existence, then, is a necessary quality for the Christian God, and to think of a being that does not exist is to refer to a being which is not the Christian God. For Anselm, this means the mere idea itself of his God presupposes existence in a very Platonic fashion, thus the ontological argument. This is a very flawed argument for a number of reasons, but it is interesting to see how he attempts to philosophically prove a theological question by attempting to bring rationality to a previously exclusively faith-based revelation system. Reason is, to him, secondary to faith, but necessary to prove its truth, characterizing his adage, faith seeking understanding. This perspective, aligned with his dialectical style of writing, would be the foundation on which the last part of the medieval era, the scholastic, would develop. Before the scholastics, philosophical writings were more literary and accessible to the general public, which changed when schools gained popularity and universities rose, allowing for greater specialization and academic focus. In the next tutorial, we will move on to examine this scholastic period to see how universities and the return of Aristotle helped forge the next few centuries of philosophy.
Thanks for watching. Subscribe to my channel for more tutorials. Support me on Patreon so I can keep making content. And as always, feel free to email me, ProfessorDaveExplains@gmail.com.